Hello, this is the video for Chapter 17, Making Modern American Culture. The essential question for this chapter is this: how did the changes wrought by the industrialization shape Americans' identities, beliefs, and culture? So, by the time we get to the end of the Civil War, most Americans believe in creationism, the idea of the Christian God creating the earth about 6,000 years ago in a matter of 6 days. However, at the or at the mid part of the century, the British naturalist named Charles Darwin theorized in the idea of natural selection, the idea of survival of the fittest. Now, while this is while Darwin sticks with animals in his theory, some people begin to apply his ideas to human institutions. One of the examples of this is social Darwinism. It's the idea that those who are financially and socially successful are the fittest of societies. They have overcome um, the equality of life, and they have worked hard enough to become successful. Um, this is a justification for those business owners, those successful elites, to say this is the reason why I'm successful and you're not. And with this idea of Darwinism comes a kind of a weird uh, um, offshoot of it, of the idea of okay, if um, evolution is real and certain traits can be passed on from one generation to another, perhaps you can breed people to have certain traits and stop the breeding of other people who have other traits that you don't want. And so this is called eugenics. It's a movement at the turn of the century where the idea that anyone who has any cognitive disabilities should be stopped from reproducing. So that way, the cognitive disabilities would not follow generations, um, that those would go away. In some cases, this was used to say certain groups of people, African Americans or lower races, should not breed, so that way those races would die out. Now, with this changing um, movement of science and modernity, some Americans are fearing that religion as they knew it could have ended. Now, many of the new immigrants who are coming to America at this time are Catholic and Jewish. And so we see Catholic elementary schools being created, um, new churches that speak home languages for immigrants are being built. Um, Jewish immigrants are creating modern sects and traditional sects of their synagogues, and missionaries begin spreading the gospel around the world. Many missionaries go to Asia to spread the word of Jesus, and this launches a new movement of the church itself called social gospel. Social gospel is the idea that um, that religious faith is improved through social justice and social welfare. Basically, that means a good Christian wants to help the poor, and so Christian churches create things like the Salvation Army to not only spread the gospel but also to help the poor through soup kitchens and shelters. Um, but by the turn of the century, most Protestants follow what's called fundamentalism, which is the belief that the Bible is absolutely true and the inspired word of God, and that it needs to be taken um, seriously, and society can be built off of the words of the Bible. Here you can see a Salvation army volunteer trying to raise money for the poor in New York City. So when we get to the turn of the century, we see many authors and artists who are beginning to turn towards realism, like the books Maggie, A Girl of the Streets, or The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn. What it's supposed to show is kind of the dirty, grimy, real life um, um, living conditions of people, both in the city but also in the country. Um, on the other perspective of that is artists who begin to change their drawings into modernism. Sorry, modernism is where they take subjects that maybe weren't necessarily drawn before, and now they are being put into artwork. Um, Artwork is becoming more abstract, where they look at maybe a certain aspect of life and they look at it from different perspectives. And the ultimate form of that we see in this time period is Cubism, which you see down here. Now, as more workers um, are gaining money and living conditions are eventually improving, elite and middle class people begin creating what are called consumer spaces, places to spend money. Um, if you've ever seen the movie The Greatest Showman, you might have seen P.T. Barnum and um, people who would put on family entertainment, invited women and children and families and um, crazy things. By the way, that movie is completely inaccurate. Almost nothing in there is true. Anyway, department stores would be places where people could go and shop for everyday items. More homes are getting electricity to power their products in their home. Telephones are being used in homes, and railroad companies begin to move people around the country. It's a way that people can travel the country and see life beyond their state. Even middle class people can travel in train cars. If you had a lot of money, you could actually buy your own train car. That's like the 1800s version of owning a private jet. However, many trains are still segregated. One example of this is the man named Homer Plessy, who was 1/8 black, and he was ordered to leave the first class car because he was considered black. He would eventually sue. A court case went all the way to the Supreme Court, and in the court case Plessy versus Ferguson, it decided that segregation did not violate the 14th Amendment as long as the accommodations were separate but equal. So this basically allows states and local areas to produce Jim Crow laws that create segregation, and those are going to be around for about 100, not 100, about 60 years. Here's a picture of what a Pullman car would look like, and you can make them super fancy and get a whole bunch of different add-ons and cool things if you buy your own Pullman car. Um, so by this time, work has changed quite a bit for many middle class men. Many more men are working in offices in big companies and not doing as much physical labor. And so this weird movement of the late 1800s for men um, begins to occur where it's like men need to feel like they're more masculine because they're not doing as much physical labor anymore. And so men kind of use athletics to show their toughness and how strong they are, like going to the YMCA, which was a place for athleticism, but also for the church. YMCA stands for Young Men's Christian Association. And so it was supposed to make men clean and strong. And it was a place where middle and working class people would actually come together where they normally wouldn't. However, the elites would not go to a place like the YMCA. They would go to their own country clubs where you had to pay dues and play tennis and golf and go swimming there. Here you can see a picture of inside a YMCA. And so by the time we get to the latter part of the 1800s, the sport baseball becomes America's game. Um, it was seen as a way to keep men out of the saloons and keep them sober. A new national league was created to create professional baseball where men would get paid. Americans began to become professional or fans of professional sports. However, African Americans were not allowed to play in professional baseball. So African Americans instead started their own league of baseball. Here you can see an African American baseball team. I believe this team is from Kansas City. Americans are going outside more often now. They're going and riding bikes, which is a new craze in the 1890s. Women are wearing lighter dresses. They're going out. Charles Gibson was an artist who made drawings for newspapers. Especially, he would draw was called the Gibson Girl, which would show women doing something athletic, showing women who were educated and independent, and then became very popular representation of women in the late 1800s. If you did have money and you could buy railroad tickets, you could go to the national parks that are popping up out in the West. John Muir and others had been pushing for new environmental changes to protect land out in the West. More and more land was being set aside by national and state governments. So, but there are some places that are not protected, like Chaco Valley, New Mexico. It's places where Native Americans had once lived, and people began rummaging through these sites for pots and antiques. So Congress passed what's called the Antiquities Act, and that was made to protect the site. This would give the president power to claim any land as a national monument. So the eventual President Teddy Roosevelt began to use this law to pass or to save land, like Devil's Tower National Monument, Mesa Verde National Monument, Muir Woods National Monument. But in some places, it was more difficult to take over. For instance, the Grand Canyon, the beautiful site, was not protected at all. In fact, people in Arizona did not want it to be controlled by the federal government, and so blocked any way of it becoming a national park. They didn't want that to happen. And while the Antiquities Act was used before to claim national monuments, it had only been used for small tracts of land. The Grand Canyon is really big, but that doesn't stop Teddy Roosevelt. Instead, Roosevelt ignored all opposition and declared all the Grand Canyon, over 800,000 acres, as the nation's largest national monument. And eventually, after they controlled the land long enough, it would become a national park. And here you can see all the national parks and forests. Now, as families move into the 1900s, family sizes are decreasing dramatically. And a big part of that is the urbanization, people moving to big cities. You don't need as many children when you are living in big cities. Instead, education becomes necessary. Also, Americans begin getting married at an older age. So, of the lower 20s, Americans are getting married at mid to upper 20s. And there's more access to contraceptives, although there is a stigma against using them. For example, Information would be put in mail and newspapers about contraceptives and giving information about it. But a law was passed that said you couldn't talk about that stuff anymore. That or any other obscene materials could not be sent through the mail. For Americans who are moving to big cities, the way to get good jobs was seen as education. You needed a high school diploma to get a professional job. College college degrees were not necessary for all professional jobs or anything like that. In 1900s, 70% of children attended school. And eventually, when we get to the 1900s, states would adopt laws requiring students to go to school. By 1920, around 8% of Americans would attend some kind of higher education in colleges. And many colleges are beginning to change. When we get to the 1800s, many schools are beginning to focus on more technical training instead of abstract majors or um, um, ministry, Christian ministry. One example of a higher education institution was Booker T. Washington's Tuskegee Institute. Um, Booker T. Washington is an African American man from a southern state, I think Georgia, and he would help African Americans to learn industrial education and technical training. And the hope was that by African Americans gaining these jobs, that they would eventually gain more economic power and gain more equality in society. However, he did give a speech in Atlanta called the Atlanta Compromise, where he seemed to approve of racial segregation for now and said that African Americans would gain equality later. Most women were, if they went to colleges, would only be allowed to go to single sex institutions. In fact, many schools, especially on the East Coast, would not allow women to go to public universities. That would eventually change in many Midwest and Western schools. This one quote, a doctor warned that women in college would unsex young women and drain energy from their ovaries, leading them to bear weak children. I don't know where he got his degree to become a doctor, but I'm pretty sure that is wrong and sexist and all that. That's bad. Women were also admitted to African American colleges. So more Americans are going to higher education schools than ever before. Here you can see a group of women in an all women's college. Now, as more women are gaining higher education, many women begin to organize for different political issues that they believe in. One of the main goals of female reformers was the temperance movement. Temperance means stopping alcohol sales. So women would form groups like the Women's Christian Temperance Union. They talked about how women want to get rid of alcohol. And a big reason was because of physical abuse, physical and sexual abuse by husbands. You see, in the 1800s, a husband could legally beat his wife and children if he wanted to. There was no such thing as marital rape in the 1800s. And so there's this belief that if men would stop drinking alcohol, that abuse and rape would decrease dramatically in the 1800s. And so this is one of the first major movements in the United States to tackle domestic violence. So there's this huge fear that alcohol leads to crime. Although many immigrants who are now coming to the United States heavily defended alcohol, especially in its uses in the church. But many women who fought for temperance also advocated for suffrage. so that women could have the right to vote. Here you can see some temperance reformers declaring that lips that touch liquor shall not touch ours. They're not going to kiss anybody who's drinking alcohol. And since everyone who's watching this is under 21, you should also take that pledge. You should not be kissing anyone who is drinking alcohol. And look, there's Mr. Keel with a lips that touch liquor shall never touch mine. He must not kiss anybody who drinks alcohol. Women were also very important in the fight for African American equality, such as the organization National Association of Colored Women. They would help African American orphans. They would find homes for the elderly. They also fought for temperance. One of the most famous African American female activists was Ida B. Wells, and she fought against lynching after 3 of her friends were lynched. Um, More organizations were created by women to win the right to vote, including the National American Women's Suffrage Association, or NAWSA. Eventually, they would get some Western states to legalize women's voting, and a goal was to possibly get Congress to create a constitutional amendment, but it would be very difficult to get this done. There were organizations created to oppose women's suffrage. They said things like, oh, it was too expensive to add more voters. Wives would just vote for whoever their husbands did, so it would just double their husbands' votes. And also, women shouldn't be subjected to the cesspool of politics. It was for their own good. And there you can see leading into the 1919, what states had women's suffrage. By 1909, you can see some of these Western states had women's suffrage. Blue had women's suffrage by 1918, so most of the Western states. Red had partial suffrage. That means women might be able to vote in state or local politics, but maybe not national politics. And in green, you can see women had no voting rights in those states. And that is it for this PowerPoint, Chapter 17. If you have any questions, please let Mr. Keel or me know. Thank you.